thank you, Moshe, for the invitation to talk today. I suspect autonomous vehicles was chosen. I mean, there's a lot of technology that could have been presented today, and I know there's a lot of focus on jobs, but it certainly has the potential to have a large impact, both on us as people and consumers, as well as jobs. And I know a lot of people will talk about that today. One of the most common questions I get when I get questions is, will my grandchildren learn to drive? And that's an interesting question. If I look at my PhD students right now, half of them don't have driver's license. So it's interesting to see whether it's actually going to be changing in the future. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the technology and a little bit about the history and things like that. And you can kind of start anywhere, really. There is automation in vehicles, and it's been around for many years. We heard a little bit about tractors earlier and things like that. There is cruise control's been around for years, and then so on. I typically like to start with these DARPA challenges that were in sort of the mid-2000s. And so in 2004 and 2005, DARPA had these challenges that were primarily driving across the desert. The real focus was on unstructured roads and different things like that. There was a lot of focus on localization and different kinds of things like that. But more specifically, I want to focus on the bottom one down here, primarily because this is the one I have the most experience with. And so the video showing in the upper right is the car that my group, Cornell, fielded in that system. You can see where things were 10 years ago with all the people standing behind barriers back there. And so the picture at the bottom here is the start line. So there was like 200. Sorry. Sorry. Yeah. I thought we were off with the. Okay. All right. Okay, we'll see how that goes. Okay. So there was about 200 teams, and that got whittled down in the semifinals and finals. This is the lineup at the finals. And so I pretty much put that up here to talk about one story, and that is that shortly after this, I mean, most of the teams were led by academics. A few were tied to industry. Rather than having that start up, I'm going to kind of. So a month or two after the challenge, and this happened right about 10 years ago, November 2007, there was a large workshop where we brought together the car industry as well as the people who were part of these teams. And pretty much we lifted up the hood and said, this is exactly how we did this and things like that. And we had a lot of discussions afterwards. And it was a very interesting conversation because there was a lot of talk about what the future was going to look like, obviously, and really the consensus that came out of that, at least from the car industry, is that there would be some safety things coming, but it would take many years for those to be developed, and then it would be decades before we'd actually see autonomous cars. And I distinctly remember going out to dinner with the academics afterwards, and there was a lot of frustration in terms of the conservatism of what was going on, and very shortly after that, Sebastian Thrun went to Google, and off went Google. So I sort of think of this as kind of an inflection point of where things went. So I'm going to show, these are just two short videos of our autonomous car when it was developed. The first one is a little hard to see, it's dark, but this is the first time we were driving it autonomously. It was in the middle of our vet school parking lot. You can actually see the steering wheel, it's half apart, it's shaking and everything like that. So this is where things were about 11 years ago. So it's in the middle of the night, everything was, the students were hooting and hollering. It was pretty cool that we could actually get it running and different things like that. That's a lot of caffeine, I'll just say it that way. But I think the more interesting one was about 6 days later. And so this is, I'm actually in this car. And so the car is going backwards at 15 miles an hour. So I don't know if you've ever driven in a car going backwards 15 miles an hour, but it's very strange. And that's the first time I realized that this is a very different animal because it had no fear, had no problems. It was very easy to do. We had the same map. All we did was flip the direction of where things were going. And it was a very interesting process in terms of where we were going. So that's why, it's certainly a little bit of a different animal. All right, so a little bit about the technology. This is a typical self-driving car. There's a variety of sensors on this. radar, which many people who speed know a little bit about. There's cameras that people know a lot about. LiDAR, there's various kinds of LiDAR. These are basically just lasers that measure range, and you can have multiple lasers inside of the housing on the top of this one rotates, and there's 64 scans, but there's a bunch of different kinds. There is localization, so GPS and inertial measurement unit and so on to tell you where you are in the world in order to give you guidance. There's an antenna so you can get map information sent to you. And then some type of computer or brains and things like that. So this is the computer from our 07 Challenge, which was just a bunch of blade systems at the time. All could be actually squashed down into fewer computers right now. Okay, so I typically talk about the software pipeline for autonomous driving. So I have just a few comments on the technologies and where some of these things are going. So there's just a couple of movies in here. So I think of this as you have all this sensor data coming in, and if you look at sort of the performers right now, they typically do some type of mixtures of sensors, depending on what they actually want to focus on. And certainly, people will talk about races in terms of who's going to win and those types of things. And certainly there's a difference of opinion on what kind of sensors are happening. A lot of it is driven by cost and those types of things, obviously. So basically all these sensors coming in. So on the left. This is a movie of us driving our car, and it's a 360-degree camera, which is why it's kind of doing something a little weird. And then right in the center here, there's that's the little can right there. That is basically 64 lasers that are spinning. And so all the colors in the center are laser returns that have depth information. Okay. So this just gives you an idea of the amount of data that's actually coming in so fast. And so really what you need to do then is you need to take that data and then turn it into some type of knowledge. So if you looked at 10 years ago during the challenge, everybody had very, very similar software architectures, which you sort of had these perception blocks and planning blocks. Perception takes the sensor data and you convert it to information, and then from that information you act. And so a lot of the times you could have problems all along this entire pipeline. So then your goal then would be to take that information and make some decisions. So turning right, turning left, stopping at an intersection, and so on. But certainly one of the future concepts is they want to have some type of automated intersections. And so I sort of found this video, building on what I talked about before. If there's no stress in the system, are you going to be able to have automated intersections that look a little bit something like this, right? So it's a little bit of virtual reality, of course. But I think the point is that you can get a lot of efficiencies. People will talk a lot about efficiencies. But the question is, will you have cars doing this, and will there be stress involved? Certainly there will not be stress involved with the cars. So just like we were talking about, Tesla does all this automation in the dark and things like that. It's the same kind of thing right now. All right. Okay, so I just have a couple slides on some of this technology. So a couple of movies. Last spring I was actually on a panel with a variety of different people, one of which was from NVIDIA, and so I took a couple of their videos. So NVIDIA, as most of you know, do a lot of the graphics cards for many years in different kinds of computers and different kinds of things. This is taking vision data and then converting it into information, just to give you an idea of what's going on. So this is the car that's just driving. This is vision data, and what they're really trying to do is they're looking for three kinds of things. They're trying to find objects in the scene, which they're putting boxes around. They're trying to figure out where the lines are on the road, and they're figuring out where the drivable space is so they won't hit anything. Okay, and so this is just a sort of a plain vanilla approach to trying to figure out exactly where you are in the world. I will talk about NVIDIA in just a minute, but it's interesting that I actually chose NVIDIA for a reason here in just a minute. One of the other technologies is very, very important, and this is something that a lot of, that pretty much most of the companies do right now, is mapping. And so what they do is they drive each of the spaces many, many times beforehand. They develop these really, really high fidelity maps. And what that does is it cuts down on the uncertainty both in your perception and in your decision making. So I sort of think of it as change control, right? So if you sort of know where all the roads are and where the road lines are and those types of things, you know, anything that's moving in there or anything different now could be a car, could be an object, and those types of things, right? So there's a bunch of technologies now, certainly internally and with companies, and this is a screenshot of one of the Waymo videos that shows streetlights and roads and things like that. And then there's a company called Here Technologies that's developed these high quality maps and things like that. So this is one of the things that has sped things along in terms of developing these high quality approaches. Okay. And then finally, there is the planning part, which is taking that information and putting it into actions. And so I'll actually show a true autonomous car at this point. And this is, again, NVIDIA. This is one of the bigger challenges, which is actually driving through some type of construction area, right? Which you know, hopefully you had mapped before, or you knew what you were actually going to do before. They have a variety of things that they're going to actually show in this video. So this is the car driving, merging onto a road. They also developed this car in California and then shipped it out to New Jersey and drove it on the roads in New Jersey. So I think at some point in this video they're flipping to New Jersey. You can see the road changes. So sometimes you have lane lines, sometimes you don't. Driving at night, that's what they're doing right in here. It actually happens to also be raining and those types of things. So you can imagine if you have sensor data, camera data, and those types of things, that's a little harder to pull out detections and information from. So it's a little bit about the pipeline. But you know, I talked at the beginning of this about the inflection point of the challenge, and I think one of the other ones is AI or machine learning or deep learning and things like that. So I put this plot up. So there's a picture here on the left of just a detection from an ImageNet competition, which a number of you probably either have participated or certainly know a little bit about. And so you're trying to find specific things in camera data, and you can do the same thing with LiDAR data and those types of things. And so finding a motorcycle or a car or a person and those types of things is key to understanding where you are in the environment. So if we think how we drive, it's the same kind of thing. We're looking for objects. We also have a mental model of how the scene changes, and so how do you encode that in the algorithms? That's a reasoning part of it and things like that. But this picture on the right is sort of is an interesting one in that it shows, this is the detection accuracy in this ImageNet competition, okay? And the blue dots are traditional computer vision, and then the green dots are using this new deep learning methodology and things like that roughly came around 2012. So in 2012, there's a huge jump in performance, is what you see there, right? And then basically the entire community shifted nearly overnight. And so the next year is almost all deep learning, and it's pretty much gone since then. And so there's a couple things you want to note there, is that it's kind of another inflection point, because what it's done is it's immensely changed not only your performance, so you see it's going all the way up to above 95%, which is better than we actually do in terms of detecting kinds of things. So it does those, but it also brought in a lot of different players that into the autonomous driving field or the autonomy field or those types of things that might not have been working on that. So for instance, NVIDIA. So the NVIDIA solution is very, very focused on deep learning, whereas you know I don't think you can say, oh, you can compare them to Google, but just the speed that they were able to bring that car up to performance and have it drive in all those different kinds of conditions was just phenomenal, and a lot of it had to do with the deep learning. So it's a little bit about technology, and let me shift gears a little bit and talk about something called levels of automation. And I don't know if people know a little bit about this, but I was just going to talk about it. Levels of automation was originally coined by the Society of Automotive Engineers, and the Department of Transportation adopted it. Really what this is that it just is a way to classify different kinds of automation such that you know what you're talking about. Certainly from a regulation standpoint, it also helps as well. So there's a few things you want to see here. Of course, you start at the very bottom, the Model T, which is no automation. The level 1 was a little bit of driver assist, which is really cruise control, okay? Level 2 is sort of the initial autopilot. And then between 2 and 3 is where things take over. So the green on the bottom, these are automated driver systems that really monitor the environment and will start to make changes on their own, okay? And so if you look at 3, you know, 3 is sort of hands off the wheel, and you have to be at the ready in case anything comes up, okay? Level 4 is high automation, which is basically you can hand drive it or it can be fully automated and it will always work. And then 5 is full automation where there actually is no steering wheel. You know, it's basically like getting on a train or a bus, an automated bus, I guess. So there's some interesting challenges that go along with each of these levels, and I think especially when you predict out or when you kind of look to see what's happening in the future, it's going to be interesting to see where these things go. So it's messed up just a little bit, but I just want to list out some of the current challenges and some of the current non-technical challenges. The first, as I mentioned, is just this reliance on maps. So as I said, it really reduces the uncertainty of that in that software pipeline. So it reduces the number of mistakes that you have. You're not as reliant on GPS, which can go in and out, especially in urban areas and those types of things. But it requires you to drive it multiple times beforehand or get those maps from somebody else. And you have to be sure that there hasn't been any changes. Right? So, if you have any type of construction zones or those types of things, those have to be captured in those types of things, right? The second is that a lot of times what people talk about when they talk about where things are currently is that they always use the term corner cases. And corner cases are just really, really hard cases to be able to handle. And certainly poor weather, working at night, sunlight, direct sunlight that comes into the cameras and those types of things. These are hard problems. And so what do you do in the when the weather is really, really bad and those types of things. So these are challenging environments. The third is more/faster learning. So I talked to I give the NVIDIA example because they're using deep learning. The whole approach to this is that you drive, collect data, and then you train your algorithms to do any one of those functions along the pipeline, right? But that requires you to continually drive, continually collect data, and the question is how do you do that enough, right? So there was a recent RAND study that came out that said you had to basically have 100 million miles of driving really to even get close to the quality of performance that you would get. So then does that bring in other kinds of technologies, virtual reality, simulation, these types of things? One of the coolest examples I heard, I think a year or two ago, I think it was from Waymo, is that they had an example of a I think it was a dog running out in front of a car, and the car did something strange that they didn't like, and so what they did is they took that data and they brought it back to their engineers, and they used that as a seed to develop 1,000 simulations varying conditions like the size of the dog, the color of the dog, the speed of the dog, the lighting conditions, and those types of things. And then they made their update, and then they trained it on all 1,000 of those conditions, right? So is that good enough? I don't know. I mean, what will the insurance companies think? These are sort of the interesting future questions, I think. The driver autonomy transitions. I mean, this concept of the driver always at the ready to take over when anything's wrong, I think is a bit laughable. I think a lot of people agree with that. And so I think a lot of people are trying to focus on, sort of the lower level safety kinds of things, and then kind of there's a lot of companies that are just looking at jumping all the way to level 5 and putting them in maybe more controlled environments or something like that. Right? And then a final one is security. We have challenges with our credit card and identities, our computers, and these types of things. And so you can imagine that in the future, maybe what they want to do is have cars talk to one another or talk to an intersection such that you can get some benefits of how people are driving through intersections and those types of things, fuel efficiencies and things like that. So certainly it opens yourself up to security problems, and so a lot of focus on sort of cyber physical security is certainly going to be one of the bigger challenges before these things are fielded. Current non-technical challenges. The first one, and I think Deborah alluded to this earlier today, is trust. So, how easy is it going to be people to get in a car and trust that it's going to do what you actually want it to do, right? I mean, if you look at autonomy and human trust, I mean, there's wonderful studies about the delay that goes on there. Just look at autopilot and different kinds of things, how long it took a lot of these things to be adopted, and a lot of it had to do with the human trust and whether they can do it. And a lot of that comes with time, but you can imagine that if you're driving really, really close to another car, or you're trying to take advantage of some of these future performance benefits, that's going to be really, really hard to do. Regulations. There was comment today that regulations are far behind where the technology is, and I certainly would not disagree with that. I don't know a ton about it except for what affects me, and so I put this newspaper headline up here, which is New York lawmakers approve self-driving car tests, and this was just this past summer. Like I also tell people that we just got Uber in upstate New York last summer, so we're a little bit behind the times. I think the interesting thing about self-driving cars in upstate New York is you can do it, but you have to have a state police officer monitoring you and following you, and you have to pay for that state police officer time. So it's a pretty high bar. So needless to say, my group typically focuses on perception and not full autonomy. The insurance companies. So somebody said the insurance companies have a big say about what's going on with this, and certainly that's going to be a big part of it. Cost has been a big driver. I think for a number of years, people thought that the LiDAR, the laser units, were going to be way too expensive. But there's a real rush to try to develop smaller versions of these and inexpensive and things like that. I think certainly they can get them down into hundreds, but can they get them down to tens of dollars like they might have cameras or even radar units? Driving ability is atrophying. Right. So what happens with that? Right. If you're the funniest story I typically get when I talk to people who are sort of in this area and they want to, I talk to them how they're in testing and it sometimes comes from companies, but not as much anymore. But I always ask them, like, what are you going to do when like a hard problem comes up, like snow or those types of things? And well, you just have the human take over. So you can imagine. Human hardly ever drives, and then you're going to give them the hardest problem, driving snow in upstate New York because you're sliding all over the place and the autonomy doesn't know how to do it. I don't think that's going to be the solution.
Ask Air France about it.
What's that?
Ask Air France.
Air France? Yeah, okay, yeah. So it's, I think that's a big challenge, and so I think there's going to be this period of where some cars have adopted and those types of things where things are going. So I'm just looking at the time. And then mixture of human-driven and automated cars. I have a number of people who I know who live in Silicon Valley, and they complain a lot when they get behind the Google car because it was just always too slow and everything like that, right? So you can imagine there being some frustration points there and things like that. So the mixtures of the two, because they might drive a little bit differently. I mean, I used to live in Boston for many years, and then I've lived in Ithaca for many years, and they drive very differently in Ithaca. So then when I go back to Boston, I mean, people are on me and honking, and you're driving too slow, and I'm like, well, I'm a low-stress driver these days. That's the way these things go. So even in different areas of the country, it might be a little bit different. So will autonomy have to adapt to where you live and these types of things? So that's kind of an interesting aspect. Okay, so key players. So I sort of group these into sort of four areas. One are sort of the traditional car companies who are trying to automate themselves. So certainly you can see General Motors and Tesla, Ford, Mercedes, pretty much everybody has some type of version. Sometimes they're quiet about it, sometimes they're not. There's also electronics and software companies, right? So Google and Waymo, a lot of people know about. Uber, depending on how you want to define them, is certainly start out with a software company and things like that. NVIDIA, Samsung, Baidu in China, and things like that. So I would say those are sort of the two big groups, but I think there's a third group, which are startup companies. There's a lot of startup companies. A lot of them are really focused on electric vehicles, going all the way to L5, and so they kind of have a long view of actually what's going on with this. And then there's some companies really focused on sensor technology, or startup companies that are focused on technology. There's focus on LiDAR as well as next generation radar. There were a number of different companies, but then they've been bought out by other companies that have been focused on software and then so on. I think the interesting thing is, everybody always wants to know who's gonna win and things like that. And I think if you look very, very far off, it's the low-level technology is going to be fairly common, I would imagine, because it's going to be focused on safety and those types of things. The race is on, though, to get at all of us, the consumer, which is kind of interesting. So I had a conversation with somebody who was in one of these electric vehicle startups, and she used to be a Motorola she used to be at Motorola. And she said, we had really good engineers, and we could have done the iPhone, but we didn't do the iPhone because the focus wasn't on the phone. It was so on the user experience and these types of things, right? And I think that's what the race is on for, right? Because I think people really want to have access to you, to the consumer, to that extra time that you actually have, and then so on. So it's going to be interesting to see which way it goes. I mean, certainly I think the electronics companies, they think they have the edge in, hey, we know how users and consumers are going, and once we can figure out how to have a safe car, we're going to take things over. And the car companies say, you don't know how to develop a reliable car and everything like that, so we're going to do the autonomy on top of it and things like that. So it is certainly an interesting approach about where things are going. So the figure on the right here was a study that was done in 2007 about trying to classify these, about whether there's leaders or followers or those types of things. And so it's certainly a look into the, I think they survey different people to see where things were and things like that. So last couple of slides, sorry. How will things change our lives? Certainly the big focus, or the big promise, hopefully, is that things are safer. And people will talk about that already. The other big byproduct is more time. So especially when, that might not affect me in Ithaca too much because I'm not in my car all that much, but certainly if you're in the big cities and those types of things, I'm just about ready to go to Boston and drive my daughter home for 6.5 hours, right? So we could automate that and things like that. Although the one side benefit is she has to talk to me for 6.5 hours. So, there's other kinds of things like that. We talked about enabling some populations. I think certainly that would be absolutely wonderful. That it doesn't mean that you actually have to your life doesn't have to be defined by the fact that you actually drive your car. How our lives change, I think there's a big focus on smart cities, and I think cities, we're going to see a big change in cities because they have the ability to control what's actually going on in there. They have some infrastructure challenges, obviously, but that's a big part of it. But I've heard a lot of stories about certainly automated parking garages and more green space and these types of things. And so I think there's a lot of city planners that are sort of looking about these things, okay? So what jobs will be impacted? I think that's what a lot of people are actually talking about. I think a lot of this stuff is obvious, and I'll let the experts talk a little bit about this. But it's, as you go further and further along, you can see a lot of things that it's actually going to affect. So we all know a little bit about taxis and Uber drivers and delivery, shipping and delivery and things like that, but certainly battery and storage technology, because a lot of these are going to be electric vehicles, so that's going to be a big part of it. Ad and sales, because they're going to have access to you. Lawyers, both in terms of what's going to happen in the near future and then the far future. Maybe there won't be as many accidents, right? So it'll be a little bit different. But if you think about all the things you have supporting your car, how many of those things are still going to be around? And when are they going to start to drop off, right? That's going to be a key question. So when will all this happen? So it's interesting trying to predict the future, as I mentioned. 10 years ago, I wouldn't have imagined Google really pushing a lot of the regulations, and I wouldn't have imagined deep learning and those types of things. So it's really hard to do it. I definitely think of these things as near term and longer term. The near term is definitely focused on structured environments. Similar, when we talk about autonomy, it's easy to do repetitive kinds of things. I think it'll be opened up a little bit, but certainly if you can have controlled environments like portions of a city that really automated taxis work on, those kinds of things will work. Trucks on highways, because you don't have other cars coming at you, is a little bit more structured and things like that. But the longer term is that I have a car that can work at home but then drive in a city. That becomes a little bit harder and things like that. And then L5, so the cars that actually don't have any steering wheels and things like that. Certainly I can imagine if you have those kinds of cars, those would work in very controlled situations like a highway that only has those kinds of cars, right? That could come a little bit more quickly. But is that kind of car going to be mixed up with other cars? It's certainly going to be a little while before that happens. So, great, thank you.
We can take maybe one questions, but please questions other than speeches. Andrew. Yeah, get a mic.
Hi, terrific talk. Andrew Chen from the University of Chicago. I'm curious, actually. You said you were in the room with a bunch of the other folks who pioneered these 2007 systems, and you had a pretty ambitious view of what could happen. So now we're 10 years later. I'm curious if you could share whether your view of the technology was accurate and whether your view of the problem was accurate.
So that's a good question. I think the view of the technology, of most of the people in there was accurate. We were technologists, so we didn't really know a lot about the regulations and getting it on the roads and those types of things, right? And so when some of the car companies pushed back and they said, it'll be longer before these kinds of things happen. I mean, we as academics felt like, you can't wait decades to do these kinds of things. I mean, if you can drive 60 miles right now today, which is what that was in 2007, you should be able to go a little bit further quickly, a little bit more quickly. But we didn't know much about the regulations. But I think one of the good things about like a Google is that they really pushed on the regulations, which is something the academics never could have done. And so while I'm a little bit jealous is that I don't have millions of miles on my car, I certainly am happy that they've actually pushed that along and things like that. I think there's been some surprises. I think certainly the price of LiDAR and these types of things. I mean, I think at the very beginning when people were developing cars, everybody said, what needs to happen is you need to focus on radar and cameras, and that's going to be the future because the cost just won't really be there. But, there's small companies and things like that have really, reduced the cost of LiDAR, and I think that's really helped things. And then the deep learning kinds of things, which is, really made cameras, something that could actually be used. So I think that it was kind of a mixture. I think some of the things I think we've seen, and some things we haven't. I think in terms of our timeline, the way we would talk about it, I think it's probably along the timeline of what we thought it should be. But I think that was more lucky than anything. I think we didn't really know all the different pressures that were going on with it. It just happened to be that we had the balancing of regulations and these new things come along that really helped out. So, good question. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much.